Dr. Collins, thank you for being here and getting to connect, and looking forward to our conversation. And so, why don't you share with our listeners a little bit about just kind of what you're up to now and any kind of projects you've been spending some time on?
Yeah, Derek, first, thanks for having me on your podcast. Really an honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and have a conversation. At this point, so I'm a pediatric cardiologist, and so that means I take care of kids with congenital heart disease. They were born with heart problems, and I'm in academics, so that means I'm affiliated with the university, and so I'm the vice chair of our Department of Pediatrics with regard specifically to faculty development and academic affairs here at the University of Kentucky. So my role is to try to help our faculty do great things and build their careers. And that really stems from a passion that I have for developing people and also for leadership. So several years ago, throughout life, people have pegged me as you're going to be a leader and this sort of thing. So all along the way doing that. And several years ago, I decided if I'm going to actually move into a formal leadership role within academic medicine, I want to be the best that I can be with regards to, my understanding of leadership and so on. I did a lot of reading of various books, ended up getting a master's degree, came up with this idea for research studies. So I do scientific research studies for leadership. And so I did a study in academic medicine where I was before, and also came up with this crazy idea for
We'll be the judge of how crazy it is.
Yeah, the leadership wisdom of Four-Star Generals and Admirals. And so trying to interview 50 of those folks just to see what their perspectives are on leadership, and get their stories and bring that all together. And so that was a 2.5-year project that culminated in my forthcoming book called The Four Stars of Leadership. So pretty excited about that. But anyway, that's a little bit of the background of what I've been doing and what I continue to do with regard to my day job and my passion for leadership and developing people.
Our listeners, there's a lot of different industries and teams, and like this idea of leadership. A lot of people have a definition of what leadership is. So I know we're going to touch a lot on leadership in our conversation today, but let's just start with getting a working definition as you see it, as you've seen it in research and in practice. Like, how would you define leadership? And then let's start there.
Yeah. So just this idea of defining leadership, there was a book published a long time ago, and in it they said there are as many definitions of leadership as there are people practicing it. It turns out there was a study that was done just not too long ago where they identified over 4,000 published definitions of leadership. But basically, leadership, as I talk about it and as I write about it, is very simple: influencing other people to achieve a common goal. That's all leadership is.
That's a lot of...
Sounds really easy.
Yeah.
Can be somewhat challenging to do, but...
You have this, you mentioned the book, The Four Stars of Leadership. Is that right?
Right.
4 Stars of Leadership. And you kind of jumped into that that project. And I guess before we get into the content of the project, the motivation behind it, is it you were looking for something and couldn't find it, and like maybe I can create it? Like where did
Right. That's a great question. So in the process of my own personal leadership development, I had been in the military, and so I had gone through leadership training in the military and had opportunities to do that. And then academic medicine was leading teams and various things. But as I started reading in about March of 2018, started reading all these leadership books that I could get on the market, right? And I'm a fairly voracious reader, so after about a year and a half, I'd read about 130 books, and I felt like I had my arms around the big ideas, but I felt like probably missing something. So I set out to get a master's degree in leadership to give me more of a formal framework about how to think about it. And as I was doing that, I got this idea for what is the book that I want to read. If there was a single book, the Swiss Army knife of leadership, that's the book I want to read. And what would that look like? And so having been in the military, knowing the requirements and the capabilities of someone who makes it to four-star officer in the military, I thought it would be so awesome to be able to have a book that had all of their wisdom in it, all of their stories. How do they think about leadership? What are the big lessons they learn? And that book didn't exist. I mean, I was scouring it. I've read so many books now. It's well over 330, I think, now. And so it didn't exist, right? And so I said, well, I have the question. I know how to write because I've published 140 some peer-reviewed journals in the literature. I came up with this idea. I'm going to try to do it, right? So that was how it started. It germinated in my head. The tough thing is, how do you get in touch with one, let alone 50? My goal was 50.
How do you connect with people who probably don't want a big public presence?
Right. I mean, a lot of these folks don't even have, like, they don't do Facebook, certainly, but they don't do LinkedIn. They don't do a lot of things, right? Because they're so high profile and targets of other entities outside of our country that they keep a low profile, and they are really, picky as to whom they might interact with and so on. And so at first, I mean, it's always trying to network, right? Like, it's networking. And so at first I was like, I don't know I don't even know like a couple of 1-stars, right? And so my buddy in Little Rock, Arkansas said, hey, I've got a neighbor who knows a something, whatever, who knows General...
Third cousin, twice removed.
Right, exactly, who knows General Wesley Clark. Hey, that's a big name. Maybe I can get... After about a year, that didn't never go anywhere, right? And so, anyway, fast forward, in spring of 2022, I conducted this study where I was differentiating. I created this tool to differentiate leadership and management, because the two are different, but to scientifically differentiate them. And one of the participants in that was Lieutenant General Joe DeSalvo. And so after he was in the study, I said, hey, can we just have a Zoom and I can talk to you? And we were talking about leadership, and I said, I got this crazy idea. What do you think? And so I told him about this crazy idea of interviewing 50 4-star generals. And I asked him, do you know any? And he said, no. This is a guy who was a 3-star general, right? Like one echelon below. He didn't know any, didn't have any contact. That tells you how of rarefied air it is, right? But he said, I was at Stanford on faculty at that time, and he said, you're at Stanford, right? Yes, sir, I am. He said, well, the Hoover Institute there typically has a couple of 4-stars that are there as fellows. Maybe they could help you. Also, try on LinkedIn. Maybe you can connect with some on LinkedIn. And I didn't want to say, sir, you're insane. So I just said, yes, sir, I'll look into that, right? So I emailed the folks at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Hey, I'm, pediatric cardiologist on the campus. Tell them what I'm doing. Ask if they could connect me with any of the 4-stars. And I also did the LinkedIn. I looked for some and sent out a few LinkedIn messages or whatever. The next day, I get an email back from the folks at the Hoover Institute. And she says, well, we have 2. One is working on a book right now, and he can't do it. The second, General Jim Mattis, said he'd be happy to. And I was just like, Derek, if there's anybody that I hold in higher regard, I can't name them for you. Like Jim Mattis, especially how he behaved and his professional bearing and integrity when he was the Secretary of Defense. Just remarkable person. And so he was the first person that I got to interview for my study, right? And since then, I mean, we still are in contact, and he refers to me as Dr. Tom and emailed me to ask me if I want to have lunch one day after I'd moved here. He didn't know that I'd left Stanford. So he was at Stanford, and he said, hey, I'm on campus. Do you want to have lunch?
You're like, Kentucky or?
And I was like, if I was on call that weekend, otherwise I would have dropped everything, bought a $2,000 ticket or whatever it would have been, and flown out to have lunch with General Mattis. Anyway, so he was the first. And then through LinkedIn,
Wow.
General DeSalvo was correct. I got a couple 3, and then they would
Snowball.
connect me, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all a little guild, and I would say,
Sure.
hey, can you connect me with 5 others? And they'd say, let me reach out to my folks, and they'll get back to you if they want to. And so I went from no opportunity, no possibility of this thing
Yeah.
happening, 9 months later, having interviewed 51 4-star generals and admirals. There are only about 250 alive.
Wow.
Okay, so nobody's done anything like this. I took all that, synthesized it, analyzed it scientifically, brought it all together, put it out. And the book, the first draft of it, 480 pages. I had to cut it in half, basically, remove half the chapters, because you're not going to walk into the store and buy a 500-page book, right? But you might walk in and say, "Oh, there's 250 pages. I can
Yeah.
do that."
Yeah.
So anyway.
You save all the pages you cut for a future
Oh yeah,
project?
yeah. That's the next book, right?
Part 2.
Yeah. I mean, I asked them all the same 4 questions. First question was, what are the 3 most important leadership lessons you learned in your career, and can you give me examples of those, how that played out? The second question, a leadership lesson you learned the hard way. How did you screw it up? The third was, how do you want to be remembered as a leader? And the fourth was 5 leadership maxims you always try to keep in mind. So I've got almost 300,000 words just from them, right? So this is going to transpire into multiple books down the road.
The conversation ago, being a military guy, talking to military people, or were you shocked by the results? Did it reaffirm a lot of things?
Yeah, I tried to go into it as a scientist and be agnostic, right? I didn't want to taint what they had to say. And so, but as you're going along, 3, 4, 5 people will say, this thing, character, is really important, or, knowing how to speak to your folks, or whatever it may be, or I'd encourage people, whatever. Okay, well, I'm starting to get a signal here, and then over time, that signal gets louder and more salient, and so that happens. Any kind of study like this that you're doing, that tends to happen. So, but I tried to remain at a distance, but sometimes I just had to jump in and be like, that reminds me of so-and-so, this other general who was telling me this story,
So I know you threw out their character. So walk through the 4, kind of what the 4 kind of C's are,
Yeah.
to set up kind of the framework for your
Sure.
findings.
Yeah, so just as you hit on, there are 4 components, the 4 stars of leadership, and all start with a C. And so the first is character, and it's competence, caring, and communication. Those 4. Can you be a pretty good leader, if you aren't very good at one of those? We can argue about that. I can walk through why that probably isn't the case. You have to be at least have some capability in any of those 4. But if you really want to be the most excellent level of leader, you're going to have to be really quite good in all 4 of those areas.
Are they in a certain sequential order? Or?
Yeah. So in the book, it's laid out as character, because character is foundational. General Charles Krulak was the commandant of the Marine Corps, so he was the highest ranking United States Marine, right? And he said, character. That's fundamental. Like, if you don't
Out
have
of the
character,
gate, that's
right,
where he, yeah.
right. And there were a couple of people, one I think in particular, that I interviewed, that he saw on my list, and he emailed me and he said, like, that was his email. Like, he was inflamed just that I would have this person that I was going to interview, because he felt like that person lacked character, and character was a non-negotiable for him, right? So he just really hammered on it. But character is first, right? It's foundational. Without it, you erode so much relationship that you got to have to be able to influence anybody. If I'm going to influence you, I need to have some kind of relationship. You need to believe in me. You need to trust in me that I have the wherewithal and I'm to get it done, but also that I'm going to be doing it for the right reasons. And so that's a really important component of it. But character, really, there are two sorts of types, if you will, there of virtues that end up comprising character. There's the personal, sort of inward focused, honor, self-discipline, those sorts of things. And then there's the outward focused virtues that are of character, compassion, encouragement, these sorts of attributes. So those things come together as character, and that's how we manifest to those that we're leading, right? Now, what does character look like? We could paint all sorts of pictures, but going back to General Krulak, and this is in the first chapter of the book, we had finished our interview, right? And I was talking to him about how I had interviewed General Mattis first, right? And how much I just thought the world of him, still do. And he said, well, I got a story about Jim Mattis for you. Well, I'd love to hear it, right? And so this is, again, it's just sort of after the fact, oh, by the way, kind of story that just crystallizes what character looks like, okay? And so when he was the commandant of the Marine Corps, again, highest ranking Marine, he would, at Christmas, he and some other folks would bake hundreds of dozens of cookies, okay? So this was a gigantic operation, and they would put like 12 cookies or whatever on a plate and saran wrap, and he would put a card from the commandant, and then they would drive around Washington, D.C. to every post where there was a Marine on duty on Christmas Day, and then they would go to Quantico, right? So the officer training center for the Marine Corps, and they would do that last. And so this one Christmas, he's out and he's doing that, and he goes down to Quantico, where General Mattis at the time was the commander of Quantico, right? And so Krulak goes around giving out all these cookies, and he finally gets to the main headquarters area. He walks in, and there's a Marine sergeant, snaps to attention, and Krulak says, here's some cookies for you. Thanks for your service today. Really appreciate you, these sorts of things. He said, who's the officer of the day? And the sergeant said, General Mattis, sir. And Krulak said, no, I don't mean who is the officer over the entire base. I mean, who is actually here today in charge? And he said, sir, it's General Jim Mattis. And Krulak is trying to figure out, why is this guy not understanding what I'm saying, right? And so he points across the room. He says, you see that cot over there? Who is going to sleep in that cot tonight? And the Marine says, sir, is Brigadier General Jim Mattis. And about this time, Krulak is about to lose his stuff, right? Because what is wrong with this guy? And he hears clink, 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 clink out in the hall. And he recognizes it as the sound of a saber striking someone's leg as they walk. And around the corner, dressed in his full military regalia, including his saber, is Brigadier General Jim Mattis. And Krulak says, and I'll keep it clean, Jim, with all due respect, what are you doing? And he said, I'm the officer of the day. Why? He said, well, I'm a bachelor. And Krulak says, I know you're a bachelor. What does that have to do with it? He said, well, the person who was supposed to be on today is a captain, and he has kids, and it's Christmas, and he shouldn't be here on Christmas Day. When I'm a bachelor, I can be here doing that. So I took the duty. And the thing about it was, nobody would have ever known. Mattis didn't tell anybody. He just went about his business. And that's character.
It's a powerful story.
It is. There are a lot of great stories about General Mattis.
Kind of what you said in the beginning, for that to be your first,
Right.
white whale or whatever it is.
Right, yeah. He was the only one I was starstruck by. Like the whole time, I'm like, hold it together, man, hold it together. Don't act professional,
Yeah. So character was first, and then what was it? What was the second one?
Competence. Okay. Yeah, you got to know what you're doing, right? From a military standpoint, you want to know that this person's going to get you home. that you're not going to die, right? They know what they're doing. And that's the same in any domain. Like, who wants to follow an idiot? Right? Like, most people, there are people in society these days who do, but most people would say, I need to know this person knows what they're doing, that I'm not going to incur personal harm, whether financial or physical, because they don't know what they're doing. And so competence is the second thing. And competence extends to all sorts of domains. Typically, you need to be good at whatever your actual profession is. So I'm a pediatric cardiologist at baseline. People expect me to know what I'm doing when it comes to being a pediatric cardiologist. That's the coin just to get into the game, right? Like, nobody's going to say, well, this guy is a total bonehead, but he smiles nicely or whatever. We'll let him be the person in charge. No, you have to fundamentally be good at your job, and then you get the opportunity to move into a leadership role. So that's there's that competence, but then there's actual competence in being able to lead. And that's where a lot of people fall short. People may be very good, let's say, at being an academic pediatric cardiologist, and they get promoted above their capabilities, right? It's called the Peter principle, promoted to the level of incompetence.
Mm-hmm. Happens all the time.
That happens all the time because somebody has some criterion. So like in academics, let's say, you need to have gotten NIH funding, right, to be a chair or a dean or whatever. What does that have to do with actually being able to lead people? Zilcho. In fact, my suspicion is it may be a negative, okay? I'm working on data to prove that, but I haven't shown that yet, okay? That's my hypothesis. And so being able to do that is lead, is really important to competence.
It is so obvious and glaring when people are in positions of leadership and they don't have it. But how many people sacrifice, like, but I've got a good gig going, or I'll sacrifice, and it's like,
yeah,
everyone sees it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, examples from some of the 4-stars, the pilots especially talked about competence, right? Like, nobody is going to follow you if you're supposed to be a pilot and you cannot fly. They're not going to, like, you start to talk, they're going to be like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, and you don't have that opportunity. So again, being able to fly the aircraft very well to win the dogfight is really important, because that tells people you know what you're doing, and that they can trust that you know what you're doing, and they'll follow that.
So character, competence.
Yeah.
What's the third one?
A surprise for a lot of people who've never been in the military, probably, caring. Right? Like, when people think of battle-hardened generals, they don't think of caring. Again, that's probably because they haven't actually had a lot of interactions with those people. I mean, if we just think back...
Or they think of Full Metal Jacket.
Right. Everybody, well, you get to a great point, Derek, and that is, people have this impression of military leadership that they have derived not from their own experience, but from the tales of Hollywood. Okay? Hollywood's in the entertainment business. They got to keep you engaged. They can't show you the 2 or 4 or 6 or however many years that it took for you to build a relationship with somebody, so that when you say, I need you to storm that bunker, you are willing to do it, right? Like that, they don't show that. They just show me yelling at you, storm the bunker, right? And they say, well, it's all command and control. It may have been at some point in our history, but that's not the way it is now. General Marty Dempsey said, you have to be willing to experience the danger and discomfort of those that you lead. And so really caring about people, who they are, where they come from, what's important to them. In our society, in professional domains these days, there's a real tendency to say, hey, you can't know each other. You can't be personable, because that's unprofessional.
Compartmentalize.
Right. And not caring about people is not professionalism. Okay, it's cowardice. It's afraid of being hurt somehow, I think. And so caring about people is fundamental to trust. And trust is foundational when it comes to effective leadership. If you don't care about somebody, they are not going to follow you. You may have to coerce them into obeying, but they're not going to willingly follow you. And if they don't willingly follow you, you're not going to get the best out of them. And so you're not going to achieve the common goal nearly as readily and to the level that you would otherwise. There are two types of caring, if you will. There's caring for and there's caring about, right? So as a leader, I care for the things that you need to be able to do your job well. That could be things as simple as a desk, a computer, electricity, paper, just fundamental things to actually be able to accomplish your job. But there's also things like, are you able to actually get sleep? Because if you're not sleeping well, then you're not going to perform well, right? Do you have a place to stay? All that. Within my capabilities, try to make sure, and that means, am I actually paying you to the level that you should be so that you can actually perform well? Not because you perform well because I give you a few extra bucks, but because you're not worrying about paying your light bill, or you actually do have a bed to sleep in or a place to live or whatever. So there's caring for, and then there's caring about. Caring about you as a person. What is it that you hope to do? Where are you hoping to go in your career? How can I facilitate you getting there? Because if I can invest in you and care about you and what you're hoping to accomplish, that's going to be rocket fuel for your success, which then is going to feed back on what we're trying to do as a team. So it makes a lot more sense for people to care about somebody else. But again, I think the easy thing, quote unquote, is to say, well, I got to keep people at arm's length because then I won't be able to make tough decisions. No, I mean, that's a part of character, right? Like, you have to have the integrity to say, I care about Derek here, but he's not getting the job done no matter how many times we've tried to go over this and how many times we've tried to retrain and all that. It's not happening. And my job first is to the mission, to what we're trying to accomplish. And so I got to say, hey, this role is not for you. Whether that's this role, this team, this company, or whatever is not for you, or here's another role. Let's move you into that and get somebody else who can come in here and help us get to where we're trying to get, right? So the thing about it is the 4 C's, I separate them out so that people can understand them and they can work on them in that, but they're all interlocking, right? So
I want to get to the fourth one, but you just said something that's interesting. Like, do you feel like it's an all or nothing situation with leadership? Do you feel like it's a house of cards, or like if a leader has 3 of the 4, like, is that possible, or is that a failure? Like, I don't know.
Sure.
Like,
yeah, that's a good question. Actually, if you have all 4 and you're really capable in all 4, you're a 4-star leader, right? But what if you're really good at caring and communication and, let's say, character, okay? You might be a grandparent, right? Because as a grandkid, nobody cares that their grandparent is competent. But man, you want to know that you can trust them. They're dependable. They're going to tell you the truth. They care about you and who you are, and they're going to help you. And they tell you they love you, and they communicate with you in meaningful ways. So that's a grandparent. So I've taken all the permutations, what you could potentially have, and created these archetypes, if you will. And one of the worst, arguably the worst, I don't know, but is what I would call the despot. And that person actually has no character, is really actually incompetent if you get down to it, doesn't care about anybody but themselves, but they can talk. They're really good at communicating and hitting the points that get people going, right? And so if you look across history at the worst leaders, that's what they are.
can I selfishly interject? Can we call it a personality disorder?
I think the DSM criteria, that's up to you, but it sure sounds like it to me.
Check some boxes.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe all the criteria aren't met, but some sound like they might be.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I could see that play out because I'm thinking of, and the reason I asked that, it's like I feel like I've seen leaders that have had
Yeah.
parts of that.
Yeah. I mean, currently I'm enrolled in a PhD program because I don't have anything else to do with my time. But no, seriously, a PhD in educational leadership, and my dissertation is actually going to be creating a scientifically valid instrument to look at people's capability across these 4 domains. And then once we know that, then I can say, hey, Derek, it looks like you're really good at these 2 areas. You're a little lower on this one, and this one over here we really got to work on, so that I can help with leadership development and training. I mean, that's a big part of what I'm moving toward, right? Is creating this framework so that we can then really build up the best possible leaders.
Well, I think about it from an organizational standpoint, some of the pitfalls of having the people in the wrong positions,
Right.
or they got promoted because they were good here. Well, they'll naturally be good here, like we talked about earlier. So if you're a career counselor listening, or HR, like I see a lot of spots for that,
Yeah.
a lot of real practical use cases for it. So let's talk about the fourth one. I think is it communication?
Communication.
So let's hear about that one.
Yeah, that one. That I can say General Les Lyles was probably the person who hammered that one the most, and he's legitimately a rocket scientist. Okay, so he was in the Air Force, and President Obama requested twice for him to head up NASA, and General Lyles was like, my plate's full, or
I'm
whatever,
good.
but he's still very much involved in those sorts of things, and just a phenomenal man, just phenomenal person. I learned so much from him, and he said, I said, what are the 3 most important leadership lessons you learned across your career? He said, communicate, 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 right? And so we worked through those, and then that came out with other people too. And a lot of times, as you know, when people are talking about something, they're talking about other things too. And so that's a part of this work, is to figure out what are the messages behind the message, what are the subjects behind the stories. And so when you look at it, communication really does come out, right? You have to be able to convey to somebody. And potentially the biggest lesson that I learned when I was doing this, and I learned so many, okay? Don't get me wrong. There's nothing I've done in my adult life, professionally or personally, outside of having kids and being married, nothing I've done has been more impactful than this project, okay? But the biggest lesson that I would say that I learned came when I was interviewing Admiral Snuffy Smith, okay? And he just passed away about a year and 2 months ago, a Navy admiral. And he said, he was from Mobile, Alabama, which is where my wife originally was from, but he said, it's not what's said that matters, it's what's heard. And then there were other 4-stars who said similar things, and General Gus Perna, who was co-directed Operation Warp Speed to deliver the vaccine, right, for COVID, his wife told him a very similar thing once. And so that idea, once I synthesized all these, was it's not what you say that matters, it's what they hear. And so when it comes to communication, I need to know you well enough. I need to know my audience. I'm using you right now, but our listeners or what have you, I need to know them well enough to know what's important to them, how they think, how they frame things, what are the ways they filter information, so that then I can communicate this idea, whatever the idea is, in a way that they will hear what I'm communicating. My intended message is actually received, as opposed to me thinking that I'm sending out the right signal and them not receiving it. the example that I've used multiple times is, imagine, we just had an inauguration. Imagine John F. Kennedy's inauguration, right? Like his soaring rhetoric, perhaps the best inaugural address in American history, right? When he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." Like, phenomenal. Now imagine you have all these people around the mall in Washington. They're there receiving this message. Imagine that he's sending it out in some remote native language, right? From, I don't know, Papua New Guinea or something. The likelihood that anybody in that audience would have received his message, even though it was beautiful in that language he's delivering it, would have been zero, right? And so as leaders, we have to think about, how are they going to receive this? Do I need to modify the way I'm saying it? Not even saying it. Maybe I got to write it. Maybe I got to do something else. How do I get it so that they actually receive the message that I intend to receive? So that was a tremendous lesson for me that I think about. I don't think daily, but very often.
Well, and it's such a good example too of how intertwined these C's are. Like, you don't know how they're going to hear it unless the care's there.
Right.
The relationship, understanding, I've got a couple kids. I've got to talk to each of them differently because I know who they are. I know what
Right.
they're dealing with, and
Yeah.
so you got to know the language of where they'll receive it from. I do like that differentiator, because when you first started, it's like, it's not what you said, but then a lot of times it's how you said it. But I love what you said. Is like, but what did they hear?
Yeah.
And that's almost, to me, that feels like more work than just being mindful of how I say something. Right? It's like, I've got to take, now empathy's coming, and now understanding and context, and they're walking out of a season that was this, and I'm about to say this over here, and so all that it's a lot of work.
Yeah, like, let's move it out into the basic, the basic sort of life zone, right? Most people who are listening will be familiar with a context where one member of, let's say, a relationship comes from a family who's loud, who's overly expressive, who might argue quite a bit, right? And the other is from a family that doesn't do that. They don't express things like that. And so, and I'm drawing from my own personal experience, okay? And growing up in my family, one side of my family is volume-wise extraordinarily loud, okay? And just knock down, drag out, get it on the floor, let's do this thing. And then, seriously, a short time later, totally forget about it, keep moving.
Moved on.
Right? Whereas my wife is not from a family that's vociferous in that regard. In fact, they're quite guarded with regard to emotion and things like that. And so I may be received by her or her family as being more emphatic if I just get a little bit charged, okay? They receive it as, oh my goodness, like it's really bad here, right? When that isn't the case at all, relative to my, frame of reference. So that's an example. You see that all the time. I've had people say, "You're yelling at me." And literally, I wasn't speaking above this volume right here, right? But it was just the cadence that I said things, or the inflection that I made on words that I was totally unaware of, in fact. But they received it as like, I'm like, dude, you don't know what yelling is. Where I'm from.
Come down to Tennessee with me.
Right, exactly. Where I'm from, we're just having a nice conversation.
Yeah, this is a quiet. As we kind of wrap up the conversation, I'd love kind of talk about you haven't talked about your podcast. So kind of plug that. So listeners here are listeners that are interested in leadership, and
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, well, thanks. So after working on this book, I realized, hey, I love having these kind of conversations, and I've learned so much. How can I continue to learn more and to share the wealth, if you will? So from that was born The Science of Leadership, my podcast. And so we put out weekly episodes, and we have just incredible guests on here. I mean, a lot of these 4-stars have returned, for an encore. And for those, I have something like 160 different big leadership ideas that came out of my work with them. And so I'll pick one. Okay, this conversation is going to be about, and it may be encouragement. Okay, just that simple. Okay, well, General, whomever, let's talk about encouragement today, and what does that mean? And so we go through it from what's referred to as a what, so what, now what model, right? Like, what are we talking about? Why is it important? Okay, what do people need to do about it? And we frame that all in the context of story. What's the story the guest or stories the guest may share? I usually will share here's how I've screwed this up, so I give a balance.
That relates with people.
Yeah, so I give the opposite on that. And then also share what scientific research has shown with regard to this concept. Here's why encouragement is important. It turns out that this study by so-and-so showed that those employees who are encouraged have 50% more productivity, decreased likelihood of leaving your organization,
or
et cetera,
whatever, yeah.
right? All those sorts of things that are so valuable. And so we cover that, and then at the end, again, we do like, okay, what are 5 or 3 or 10 different practical tips that people can do to improve on this? So that's the Science of Leadership podcast.
And I've enjoyed as we've kind of crossed paths and been listening, and I love the practicality of it. And so listeners, I know you guys will, get something out of it as well. I do, the Science of Leadership is a draw too, because I'm sure, like you said, you're an avid reader. There's a lot out there that's not necessarily evidence-based in leadership spaces.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are a lot of people out there who
make a lot of money talking about
huge amounts of money and stealing other people's ideas a lot of times, or things of that nature, and just spouting off all sorts of stuff that it's like, oh my goodness, right? So, yeah, my goal is to try to disabuse people of some things, and really focus on, look, here's what we know works, and here's why it works, and here's how you can do it.
Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation and your time, and
Yeah.
I'm excited to, I think you said possibly sometime later this year the book will come out.
Yeah, the book, I mean, with publishing, it's always this sort of,
Hurry up and wait.
Right, it's hard to know for sure, but we're nearing the, I hope, the end of the editing process, and so looking forward to actually getting it out there and sharing it with people.
And remind, you may have said it earlier, but what's the website that they can get more information?
Yeah, so we have fourstarleaders.com, www.fourstarleaders.
The number 4 or the word 4?
The word 4,
Okay.
FOUR, leaders.com. So people can check us out there. We're on Facebook and Instagram and all that sort of stuff.
You're on LinkedIn looking for 4-Star Generals and Admirals.
That's right. I'm on. You can find me on LinkedIn for sure. And we do have a 4-Star Leaders page on LinkedIn as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, appreciate it.
Yeah, Derek, absolute pleasure to be here with you. Great conversation. Thanks for having me.